April 19, 1993, 6 in the morning. The FBI informed the people inside the Mount Carmel compound near Waco, Texas, that tear gas was coming and that they should surrender. They refused. By the end of that day, more than 76 people were dead, including 25 children, and one of the strangest and most violent standoffs in American history was finally, catastrophically, over. To understand what happened at Waco, you have to understand the man at the center of it. He was born Vernon Wayne Howell on August 17, 1959, in Houston, Texas, to a teenage mother who left him to be raised by his grandparents. He grew up lonely, was placed in special education classes, and dropped out of high school in the 10th grade. He worked odd jobs and drifted between Texas towns with no clear direction and no obvious future. But from a very young age, he was consumed by two things: the electric guitar and the Bible. As a teenager, he could recite hundreds of chapters of scripture from memory, chapter and verse, without hesitation. It was the one thing he was undeniably, extraordinarily good at, and he knew it. The Branch Davidians were an obscure offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, founded in 1959 and built around apocalyptic readings of the Book of Revelation. They had settled at a compound outside Waco called Mount Carmel, living simply and communally, awaiting the return of Christ. When Vernon Howell encountered them in the early 1980s, he found the audience he had been looking for his entire life. He had a magnetic, hours-long preaching style and an almost preternatural ability to weave scripture into a coherent, urgent, and personally compelling vision of the end times. People listened to him the way they had never listened to anyone else. Then they followed him. By the mid-1980s, a power struggle inside the Branch Davidians put Vernon Howell in direct conflict with the group's existing leadership. He maneuvered carefully, recruited loyalists, and ultimately prevailed. By the end of the decade, he was the undisputed leader of Mount Carmel. In 1990, he legally changed his name to David Koresh. The choice was not casual. David was the biblical king of Israel. Koresh was the Hebrew rendering of Cyrus, the Persian ruler who freed the Jewish people from their Babylonian captivity. He was announcing to anyone who cared to listen exactly who he believed himself to be, and an alarming number of people believed it along with him. Life inside Mount Carmel was entirely organized around Koresh. Members followed a rigid structure of Bible study, communal prayer, and physical labor. Contact with the outside world was tightly limited. Koresh used rock music as a recruiting tool, playing guitar himself and decorating compound walls with posters of bands like Megadeth, presenting himself as a prophet who also understood the language of the wider culture. He taught that God had given him specific instructions to take multiple spiritual wives and father a generation of children who would one day rule the coming kingdom. He called this vision the House of David. Many members accepted it as divine revelation. Others, particularly those who eventually left, would describe it plainly as systematic abuse of power and of people. Alongside his theological claims, Koresh preached that God had commanded him to build an army of God in preparation for the final violent confrontation of the end times. The group began acquiring weapons and ammunition at a scale that went far beyond anything a private religious community could reasonably justify. Former members who had left the compound began talking to authorities, describing illegal modifications to firearms and making allegations of child abuse inside the compound. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms opened a formal investigation. By early 1993, they had accumulated enough evidence to obtain warrants. What they had not developed was a sound or cautious plan for carrying those warrants out. On the morning of February 28, 1993, roughly 80 ATF agents moved on Mount Carmel to execute search and arrest warrants. The Branch Davidians were waiting for them. The agents were met immediately with a sustained barrage of gunfire. 4 federal agents were killed and dozens more were wounded. 6 Branch Davidians also died in the initial exchange. The gun battle that erupted that morning would later be described by investigators as the most intense in American law enforcement history. The ATF withdrew from the scene. The FBI assumed command of the situation, and what would become a 51-day siege had begun. Nearly 900 law enforcement officials eventually surrounded the compound, including FBI hostage negotiators, tactical units, and a substantial fleet of armored vehicles. The siege unfolded live on national television for weeks. Negotiators spent hours each day on the phone with Koresh, who lectured them on scripture and kept shifting his terms. The FBI responded by cutting off electricity to the compound, flooding the buildings with blinding floodlights through the night, and blasting recordings of music, crying babies, and other disorienting sounds over loudspeakers. But the deeper problem was internal. The negotiators and the tactical commanders were pursuing contradictory strategies, and that unresolved conflict inside the FBI's own chain of command would prove to have fatal consequences. Over the weeks of negotiation, the FBI secured the release of 19 children from the compound, which represented one of the few concrete results of the talks. But 98 people remained inside, and Koresh continued to find reasons to delay. He promised to surrender after Passover. Then he said he was waiting for a specific message from God. Then he said he needed more time to complete a manuscript he was writing about the 7 seals of Revelation. FBI leadership in Washington was running out of patience. On April 18th, Attorney General Janet Reno approved a plan to inject CS tear gas into the compound buildings and force a resolution. She would later publicly state that she regretted authorizing it. At 6 in the morning on April 19th, FBI armored vehicles began breaching the compound walls and pumping CS tear gas into the buildings. The Branch Davidians did not come out. Hours passed with no movement. Then, at multiple points inside the compound simultaneously, fire broke out. Investigators would subsequently determine that people barricaded inside had spread accelerant and deliberately set the buildings ablaze. The wooden structures burned with extraordinary speed. Only 9 people managed to escape the fire. David Koresh was found dead inside the ruins, killed by a gunshot wound to the head. When the fire was out, investigators moved through the ash and rubble of what had been Mount Carmel. 76 Branch Davidians had died in the fire, among them 25 children. 4 ATF agents had been killed on February 28th. The compound was a total loss. The FBI and the Justice Department maintained that the Branch Davidians had set the fire themselves and cited forensic evidence and eyewitness accounts to support that conclusion. Survivors and a substantial number of outside critics disputed it. Congressional hearings were convened. Independent investigations followed. The fundamental questions about who bore ultimate responsibility for the deaths never reached a conclusion that satisfied everyone, and in many quarters they still have not. In the months following the fire, Waco became a galvanizing symbol for a rapidly expanding anti-government movement. Militia groups multiplied across the country, explicitly citing the siege as evidence that the federal government was willing to use lethal force against American citizens on American soil. A video titled Waco, The Big Lie, circulated widely through right-wing networks, alleging a deliberate massacre carried out by federal agents. Millions of Americans who had no sympathy for Koresh's theology or his methods still looked at the government's conduct during those 51 days and came away troubled. The anger that Waco generated was broad, it was deep, and it was not going to dissipate on its own. On April 19, 1995, precisely 2 years to the day after the compound at Mount Carmel burned to the ground, Timothy McVeigh detonated a truck bomb outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. McVeigh had driven to Waco during the siege and set up outside the perimeter, selling bumper stickers. He had watched the compound burn on live television. He named Waco explicitly as the primary justification for what he did. The bombing killed 168 people, including 19 children in a daycare center inside the building. The siege that ended with 76 dead had now, through the chain of rage it ignited, contributed to the deaths of 168 more. More than 30 years on, Waco remains one of the most argued over events in modern American history. It forced genuine and unresolved questions about the limits of government authority, the legal and moral standing of religious communities, no matter how extreme their beliefs, the circumstances under which the state may use force against its own citizens, and what law enforcement owes to the people caught inside a situation it helped create. David Koresh was, by almost any serious measure, a dangerous and manipulative man who systematically exploited the trust and devotion of the people who followed him into that compound. But the government's response to him produced a catastrophe for which no single party has ever been held fully accountable. Waco is not a story that resolves into clean villains and clean heroes. It is something far more recognizably American than that. A tragedy that grew from absolute conviction, from institutional fear, from a failure of imagination on every side, and from the terrible human cost of not finding any other way out.